In a stone farmhouse clinging to a Pyrenean slope, a woman wakes before dawn to milk goats whose lineage stretches back centuries. Her hands move through routines her grandmother's grandmother knew, speaking words in a language no outsider understands. The valley below remains dark. The nearest neighbor lives an hour's walk away. This is normal. Then, slowly, something begins to shift. A son leaves for a town she's never seen, to attend a school that teaches in a language she doesn't speak. The road that was impassable each winter is now maintained by men from the lowlands. A tax collector arrives asking questions she cannot answer. The assembly under the oak tree grows smaller each year as families disappear toward cities with names that sound foreign on her tongue. Within a generation, the farmhouse stands empty. The language spoken there for millennia falls silent. The communal fields return to forest. No war came, no plague swept through. The mountains didn't change. Everything else did. This is the story of the Basques, a people whose isolation created a world unlike any other in Europe, and whose encounter with modernity erased it almost without resistance. What was lost wasn't just a way of life. It was proof that another way was possible. The high valleys of the Pyrenees existed outside the logic that governed the rest of Europe. Where France met Spain without truly joining, steep slopes held villages that had no allegiance to either kingdom. The Basques called themselves Euskaldunak, speakers of Euskara, a language that predated Latin, predated the arrival of Indo-European peoples entirely. A Basque farmer knew every rock formation on his land, every spring that ran dry in summer, every pasture that flooded when autumn rains came heavy. This knowledge wasn't romantic, it was survival. The mountains gave nothing easily. A family's baseri, the stone farmhouse that had stood for centuries, represented not wealth but endurance. Multiple generations lived under one roof, not by choice, but by necessity. The work was constant. Before dawn, someone was already moving, checking livestock, hauling water, preparing the day's bread. Children learned by watching, by doing, by understanding that their family's survival depended on mastering skills their parents had inherited from their parents. There were no alternatives. No nearby towns offered factory work. No roads connected them to markets where they might sell beyond what neighbors needed. Each village was its own complete world, dependent on every family fulfilling their role. Harvest meant collective work parties moving from farm to farm, 30 people descending on a single field to cut grain before weather turned. Winter meant isolation so absolute that a family might not see outsiders for months. The Basques didn't live this way because it was idyllic. They lived this way because the mountains made every other option impossible. The thing that shaped Basque life more than anything else was something they didn't choose and couldn't change. Geographic isolation so complete it functioned as a fortress without walls. The valleys were connected by paths that disappeared under snow each winter, by roads that washed out in spring floods, by passages only locals could navigate. A journey that took 2 hours in summer might be impossible for 6 months. This wasn't inconvenience. It was a fundamental barrier between the Basques and the kingdoms that claimed authority over them. Spanish kings issued laws. French administrators drew maps. Neither could enforce much in mountains where their soldiers couldn't reach and their tax collectors didn't know the routes. The result was accidental autonomy. Basque villages governed themselves because no one else could. They resolved disputes in assemblies under ancient oak trees because no court existed within reasonable distance. They created inheritance systems that made sense for their circumstances because royal law couldn't touch them. But isolation also meant deprivation. New farming techniques developed in the lowlands never arrived. Medical knowledge advanced elsewhere, while Basque healers relied on herbs and hope. Books circulated in cities, while mountain villages remained almost entirely illiterate. A child born in a Basque valley had access to the accumulated wisdom of their immediate community and almost nothing beyond it. When disease came, they had no doctors. When harvest failed, they had no reserves to purchase. When questions arose that local knowledge couldn't answer, they simply remained unanswered. The mountains protected them from outside control, but they also trapped them in a cycle where change came slowly or not at all. Before modernity arrived, Basque society had developed something remarkable, a functioning alternative to the feudal structures that dominated Europe. There were no nobles ruling Basque valleys. No lords demanded labor or tribute. No church hierarchy controlled village life the way it did elsewhere. Instead, power resided in the Execojon and Execoandre, the heads of each household, who gathered in open assembly to make decisions affecting the community. Women participated in these assemblies, something unthinkable in most of Europe. The discussions were practical, focused on matters everyone understood: how to allocate communal forest land, when to organize road repairs, how to divide water rights during drought. Decisions required consensus because enforcement required cooperation. You couldn't compel your neighbors when you'd need their help during next month's harvest. This created a culture where disagreement had to be resolved, where compromise wasn't weakness, but survival strategy. The inheritance system reflected this pragmatism. Unlike the rest of Europe, where the eldest son inherited everything, Basque law allowed any child to inherit the Baseri, regardless of gender or birth order. The parents chose who would continue the farm based on capability and willingness. The chosen heir didn't own the Baseri so much as become its steward, responsible for maintaining it and passing it to the next generation. Siblings who didn't inherit received support until they married or established themselves, but the farm remained intact. This prevented the endless subdivision that destroyed family holdings elsewhere. It also created a concept of property that was more about responsibility than possession. The Baseri existed beyond any individual. Families came and went, but the farmstead endured. The language they spoke made them incomprehensible to everyone else. Euskara belonged to no known language family. Linguists could trace Spanish to Latin, French to Latin, even English to Germanic roots that connected it to a broader Indo-European family. Euskara connected to nothing. It was older than the Roman Empire, older than written history in the region. To speak it was to access something profoundly ancient. A Basque child learned words their ancestors had used 5,000 years earlier. The language had no connection to neighboring tongues, which meant a Basque speaker and a Spanish speaker standing 5 kilometers apart might as well have been from different continents. This created fierce identity. To be Euskalden was to belong to something that couldn't be erased by conquest or conversion, because it existed in the structure of thought itself. But it also created profound practical problems. Basque children grew up unable to read the laws that supposedly governed them, because those laws existed only in Spanish or French. When church reforms required priests to preach in local languages, the Basque regions were the last to receive them, because so few priests spoke Euskara. When royal administrators arrived to conduct censuses or collect taxes, they brought translators who were often unreliable or corrupt. The language was a shield, but it was also a cage. It meant Basque traders in lowland markets faced contempt and exploitation, unable to argue prices or understand contracts. It meant Basque soldiers conscripted into national armies couldn't understand orders and died in confusion. It meant that literacy, which was transforming Europe, remained almost non-existent in Basque villages, because the written word existed in languages they didn't speak. The breaking point came gradually, almost invisibly at first. By the 18th century, Spain and France had consolidated enough power to turn their attention toward regions that had functioned with near autonomy. They didn't invade. They built roads. Engineers surveyed mountain passes that had defeated armies and constructed routes that remained passable year-round. Suddenly, villages that had been isolated for centuries were accessible. Tax collectors arrived with regularity. Priests trained in Spanish seminaries replaced local clergy who had conducted services in broken Euskara. Schools appeared, funded by the state, teaching only in Spanish or French. Parents faced a choice: send children to these schools and watch them become strangers, or keep them home and watch them become obsolete. The schools taught reading and arithmetic, valuable skills, but they also taught that Euskara was backwards, that Basque customs were primitive, that progress meant abandoning the old ways. A generation of children learned to feel shame about the language their grandparents spoke. They learned that opportunity existed in cities, not mountains. They learned that the future looked nothing like the past. At the same time, economic changes made traditional mountain farming increasingly unviable. Industrial agriculture in the lowlands produced more food with less labor, Markets that had once valued Basque cheese and wool now preferred cheaper factory products. The Basques system, which had worked for centuries, began to collapse. Young people looked at lives of brutal labor on marginal land and chose differently. They left for factory work in Barcelona or Bilbao, for service positions in Madrid or Paris. They sent money home but didn't return. Villages that had maintained populations for 1,000 years began to empty. By the early 20th century, the hemorrhage had become undeniable. Basque villages that once held 200 people shrank to 50, then to 20. The communal assemblies under the oak trees continued, but with fewer voices each year. Fields that had been cultivated continuously for centuries returned to scrubland. Stone farmhouses, built to last generations, stood empty as families moved to cities or died without heirs willing to continue the farm. The language began its steep decline. Parents who spoke Euskara at home often chose to speak Spanish or French with their children, believing it would give them advantages in a world that increasingly demanded assimilation. Schools actively punished children for speaking Euskara, requiring them to wear humiliating signs or endure physical punishment if caught using their native tongue. Within 2 generations, villages that had been monolingual Euskara became majority Spanish-speaking. The teenagers who remained spoke Euskara with their grandparents, but Spanish with their friends. They consumed media in Spanish, dreamed in Spanish, planned futures that had no room for the language of the mountains. The social structures that had made Basque life distinctive collapsed alongside the population. The Basque inheritance system required someone willing to inherit. When all the children left, the farmstead simply ended. The communal work parties required enough people to make cooperation worthwhile. When villages shrank, families worked alone or hired laborers from elsewhere who didn't understand local practices. The assemblies required broad participation to maintain legitimacy. When only old men remained, decisions made under the oak tree increasingly didn't matter. The linguistic death spiral accelerated through the mid-20th century. Franco's dictatorship in Spain actively suppressed regional languages, viewing them as threats to national unity. Speaking Euskara in public could result in fines or arrest. Publishing in Euskara was prohibited. Education in Euskara was illegal. For nearly 40 years, the language survived only in private spaces, homes, family gatherings, clandestine cultural events. An entire generation grew up unable to use their ancestral language in any official capacity. They couldn't use it in schools, in government offices, in courts, in hospitals. The language that had survived Roman conquest and medieval warfare was being systematically erased by bureaucratic policy and economic pressure. On the French side, the approach was less overtly repressive, but equally effective. French educational policy promoted linguistic uniformity under the banner of equality. Regional languages were dismissed as patois, dialects unfit for serious communication. Basque children attended French schools where they learned that real culture, real literature, real thought happened in French. The message was clear. Euskara belonged to the past, to grandparents and old customs, not to the modern world being built. By the 1970s, linguists were predicting Euskara's extinction within a generation. The youngest native speakers were middle-aged. Transmission to children had nearly ceased. The language seemed destined to become what Latin had become, a historical artifact studied by specialists but spoken by no one. What remains today is a landscape transformed beyond recognition by anyone who lived there a century ago. Some Basque villages have been repopulated by urbanites, seeking rural retreats, by tourists staying in renovated farmhouses that now serve as boutique hotels. The Basques that once housed multi-generational families working the land are now weekend homes for professionals from Madrid or second properties for retirees. The fields aren't worked, the livestock are gone, the stone buildings endure, but the life they were built to contain has vanished. Other villages simply ended. Walking through them now means encountering ruins, roofless houses with trees growing through floors, collapsed barns, stone walls returning to the hillsides from which they were built. These aren't ancient ruins. These are places where people lived within living memory, abandoned so recently that photographs exist of the last inhabitants. The language survived barely through conscious revival efforts that began in the 1980s. Basque language schools were established, teaching Euskara to children whose parents often didn't speak it. The language exists now as cultural heritage, something learned rather than inherited, spoken by choice rather than by birth. It's taught alongside Spanish or French, a secondary tongue associated with identity, but not with daily necessity. The Basque system exists in museums and historical societies, explained to tourists as an interesting alternative to primogeniture. The communal assemblies happen as reenactments during cultural festivals. The Basque Mountains demonstrate something uncomfortable about cultural diversity and modernity. For centuries, geographic isolation preserved a genuinely different way of organizing human life, different inheritance laws, different governance structures, different linguistic frameworks, different concepts of property and obligation. The Basques proved that alternatives to feudalism, capitalism, and state authority were possible and functional, but they also proved that such alternatives require separation. Once roads connected the valleys to wider markets, once schools taught national languages, once economic opportunities drew young people away, the alternative couldn't survive. It wasn't violently suppressed, though suppression certainly occurred. It was outcompeted. The modern world offered individuals more freedom, more opportunity, more comfort than the traditional Basque life could provide. Young people choosing cities over mountains weren't betraying their culture. They were making rational decisions about their futures, but those individual rational decisions, aggregated across generations, produced collective cultural extinction. What made Basque mountain life remarkable also made it vulnerable. The tight social bonds that enabled communal decision-making required everyone to participate. The language that expressed unique cultural concepts became a barrier in a world that demanded linguistic uniformity. The inheritance system that preserved farmsteads required descendants willing to farm. When any piece of the system broke, the whole structure became unsustainable. The loss isn't just nostalgic. It represents the elimination of demonstrated alternatives to how society can be organized, how property can be conceived, how decisions can be made. Each cultural extinction narrows the range of possibilities humans know are viable. The Basques showed that you could have gender equality in inheritance in the 15th century, that you could govern by consensus assembly without written constitutions, that you could maintain community across generations without state apparatus. Those examples no longer exist as living practices, only as historical footnotes.